All right, everyone, it's your boy Fernie here back with another new Mafia and Gangsters video. Once again, continuing the wonderful book Super Mafia Organized Crime Threatens America by Jonathan Harris. We're going to start a whole new chapter here, chapter 8, which is titled Lawmen versus Mafiosi. As you can tell by the title of this chapter, it's going to chronicle the several ways that law enforcement is battling the mafia. They're going to include several notable examples as well. And it's a pretty good sized chapter, so I'm going to split it into two parts here. So without further ado, let's go ahead and let's start this chapter 8. I'll give my own thoughts and opinions on it. Let me know what you guys and gals think. So again, chapter 8, the title is Lawmen versus Mafiosi. It starts with a quote. It says, "Big shots were going to jail every day. The strike forces and FBI were getting a handle on it. Their modern surveillance techniques were very widespread. Their knowledge of the mafia's inner working more definitive. Their informant network now penetrating all the families. The conviction rate of mafiosi in recent years was staggering." And this is from a quote from Ora Demaris from a book called The Last Mafioso. So here's essentially the beginning of this chapter. It says, "These are the terms in which ex-mobster Jimmy Fratiano described for his biographer the mounting disasters that began to befall the mafia in the early 1980s. The picture he drew is even more accurate today. Since 1979, the mafia boss in every major city where the mob functions has either been indicted or convicted and jailed. The entire top leadership in three cities, Los Angeles, Cleveland, and New Orleans, is serving long prison sentences. Further major prosecutions are in the works. Floyd I. Clark of the FBI's Criminal Investigative Division told a New York Times correspondent in November 1983, "It's the greatest achievement we've had in organized crime." But Clark hastened to warn against undue optimism. The mafia was still a serious problem. It continued to operate while its leaders were in jail. The impressive recent record marks a drastic turnaround in law enforcement tactics and strategies. For 30 years, from the 1930s, early 1930s, when the mafia first organized on a nationwide basis, to the early 1960s, federal law agencies knew very little about the mafia's structure and workings. The mob in those years was run by the original immigrant generation, men like Al Capone, Johnny Torrio, Charles Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese. These ruthless bosses maintained iron discipline among the mafiosi. The rule of omerta was absolute. No one dared talk. Police attempts to penetrate the mob failed. The top men and big-time operations seemed insulated from attack. The problem was complicated by the rigid attitude adopted by J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI during this entire period. For some reason, he was convinced that the mafia was a myth, a figment of newsmen's overheated imaginations. FBI agents were strictly forbidden to quote-unquote waste their time on investigations having anything to do with the mob. The FBI tended to concentrate instead on notorious outlaws and bank robbers like John Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, Machine Gun Kelly, and Pretty Boy Floyd. Spectacular chases and highly publicized shootouts kept the FBI in the headlines and ensured public support. Considerable FBI manpower was also deployed against suspected political radicals and organizations accused of being subversive. The first change in public attitudes towards organized crime came with the U.S. Senate hearings chaired by Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee in the early 1950s. These were the first such proceedings ever televised, and the entire nation was fascinated by the images of top mobsters squirming in the full glare of publicity. New Senate hearings that began in 1957 heightened public concern. Once again, key sessions were televised. The particular focus of the hearings was labor racketeering. It was then that the American public first became familiar with the name and personality of Teamster boss Jimmy Hoffa. His verbal duels with the Senate Committee's counsel, Robert F. Kennedy, kept television audiences enthralled. After the election of his brother John to the presidency in 1960, Robert Kennedy became Attorney General of the United States. He was now technically J. Edgar Hoover's boss, but no previous attorney general had ever dared challenge the FBI director's entrenched authority. Kennedy ordered Hoover to get into the investigation of organized crime, and he made the order stick. The FBI's increasingly successful campaigns against the mafia date from that confrontation. The nation gained new insights into mafia power in 1963 when a mafioso named Joe Valachi testified before the Senate committee. It was a historic occasion, the first time a made guy had ever spoken out in public about the mob's inner secrets. Before Valachi's testimony, few law enforcement officers had ever heard of the term Cosa Nostra, used as another name for the mafia. The first major federal legislation reflecting the new awareness of organized crime was enacted in 1968, called the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act. Its main object was to strengthen law enforcement by state and local authorities. But another of its provisions turned out to have far greater impact. It authorized federal officers to use electronic surveillance techniques against organized crime so long as it was done under strict supervision by the courts. Previously, evidence gathered by wiretapping, bugging of use of hidden microphones, and the wearing of concealed tape recorders by undercover operatives was often not allowed in criminal trials. Now these methods became the basis for a string of successful prosecutions that would otherwise have failed because of insufficient evidence. Enacted that same year was the Consumer Credit Protection Act. With its tough penalties for extortionate credit transactions, it was the first federal law aimed at loan sharks. Even more sweeping was the Organized Crime Control Act of 1970. One major section of this long and complex statute is known as the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, often nicknamed RICO. This innovative law attacked the organized crime problem in new ways. It set its sights on patterns of racketeering activity. Among the patterns that were now outlawed were investing the profits of illegal activity in any enterprise, acquiring or maintaining a share of any enterprise through racketeering, and using any enterprise for racketeering purposes. The law also made it a federal crime to run or even belong to a continuing criminal enterprise such as a mafia family. Finally, law enforcement officers were given the power for the first time to go after and seize the assets of mob enterprises. The idea was to take the profits out of the rackets. The penalties provided under the RICO statute were severe. Prison terms were 20 years, fines of $25,000, and mandatory forfeiture of any property obtained illegally. Victims were authorized to sue in the civil courts for triple damages. FBI Director Webster has described RICO as the most powerful federal statute available to us. The full effects of these enactments were not felt immediately. Several years were required for the FBI and other federal agencies to learn to use their new powers and to build their cases. The FBI's budget needs for the war on organized crime rose steeply to nearly $100 million in 1984. Over a fifth of the agent's total time was concentrated on this objective. The results are only now becoming apparent. From the mafia's point of view, the most dangerous section of RICO has proven to be the one that penalizes mob bosses for running a continuing criminal enterprise. In 1980, two top mafiosi, Frank Funzi Thierry, boss of New York's Genovese family, and Dominic Brooklier, the Los Angeles mob boss, were convicted and sentenced to long terms precisely because of the positions they held in the mob. Their convictions also marked the first time that any courts had formally recognized the existence and nature of the mafia. According to Lieutenant Fred Martins of the New Jersey State Police, enforcing the section of RICO providing for the confiscation of assets from mob bosses is not as easy as it sounds. These enterprises do not keep books in the way that legitimate businesses do. The money is often very difficult to trace. The assets are often secretly transferred to front people who are not directly involved in criminal activities and are hard to get at. Asked about this by the Senate Judiciary Committee, Webster of the FBI explained that RICO has no provision to stop somebody from moving their assets around, and the courts do require an exact tracing of illegal money before it can be seized. Florida has its own RICO and has had good success in seizing a drug smuggler's assets. According to Major Nick Navarro of the Broward County Sheriff's Department, in 2 years, his organized crime unit had captured 14 airplanes, 16 boats, $853,000 in cash, and 382 vehicles worth a total of $5 million. Every car we drive, he added, is one we seized. Situated just north of Miami, Broward County has become a favorite drug delivery area for many years, but the smugglers now tend to avoid it. And then the next section is called New Priorities. For the new federal offensive to succeed, one of the most important lessons that had to be mastered was how to harness all the federal law enforcement agencies into a smoothly coordinated and cooperative team. As recently as 1977, Time magazine complained that pressure on organized crime has eased considerably in the past few years because of the disarray among federal law enforcement agencies, notably the FBI, IRS, and Drug Enforcement Administration. The picture today is drastically different. The most important new factor has been the Organized Crime Strike Forces. The first of these was set up in Buffalo in 1968. Today, there are 15 of them, operating in 28 cities that have a high incidence of mafia and other organized crime activity. Combining their expertise in these team efforts are the FBI, Internal Revenue Service, Drug Enforcement Administration, Secret Service, Customs Service, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, the Department of Labor, and state and local authorities. The strike forces' effectiveness is enhanced by their being under unified command. A single agency, the Justice Department's Organized Crime and Racketeering Section, keeps them pulling together. Their prosecution and conviction rates are setting new records. To achieve these results, the federal lawmen had to unload some outdated policies and forge new ones better adapted to the problems of today. At first, the policy was to get the mafia mobsters on whatever charges could be made to stick. This approach produced volume, satisfyingly large number of convictions, but often for not very serious offenses. The result was that many mobsters got short sentences or even probation. The turning point came in 1976 when OCRS ordered new priorities. Criminal operations that affected broad segments of society, like the infiltration of legitimate businesses and the corruption of labor unions, were singled out as the prime targets. Now, sweeping results could be achieved under RICO's racketeering provisions with their lengthy jail sentences. Federal agencies had developed 5 investigative techniques to new high levels of efficiency over the past few years. They include electronic surveillance, the use of informants, witness immunity, the Witness Protection Program, and infiltration by undercover agents. Different from these, but increasingly helpful in all aspects of the war against the mafia, is the FBI's new computerized organized crime information system. And that's it. Let's go ahead and let's pause it here. That way we continue the next part of this chapter 8, Lawmen versus Mafiosi, in the next video. So let's talk about that here. Interesting chapter, right? It highlights the turning point when it comes to the way law enforcement was handling the mafia. It seems like before there was hardly even any acknowledgement that the mafia even existed. And it seemed like the turning point was slowly after a certain time period. That's when new laws, new provisions started to come into place that would allow any courts, any law enforcement officers, and so on, to not only start getting people in the mafia that they earlier couldn't get before, but also change things when it came to sentences. Whereas before it was light sentences, now there were going to be very, very heavy ones. I mean, when you hear something like 20 years sentence, that's pretty huge. And the idea that some of these that these laws that were being passed, especially stuff like RICO, would now have those that operate any type of illegal enterprise and continue to do so, and even just be involved in it in just a light manner, could be sentenced in these form of heavy jail times. That definitely changed things afterwards. The chapter also highlighted how there were several notable people of the mafia who started becoming informants. Like they started actually being part of witness protection program, immunities. They started to testify in courtrooms. There was the example made of the first made guy to ever do any type of testimony. So there was definitely that form of omerta was slowly getting weaker and weaker within the mafia. There's probably several reasons related to that as well, but the chapter didn't really cover anything really on that. But still, once that happened, that also led to so many convictions because of the testimonies that these mobsters were doing there in the courtrooms. And then there was all these organizations within the government now working together, all as one, as opposed to where it was more scattered here and there. And then on top of that, the chapter highlighted how the budget associated with the war on organized crime was given a much higher budget from before to now, at least at that point, $100 million in 1984, which is a lot of money, absolutely a lot of money, especially for that time period. So interesting stuff. Lots of ways that these law enforcement officers and departments started to work together and then use all these new laws for it, along with the help from several of the mafia as well. And that's how we get to this part of the chapter. So I'm going to finish the rest of it next video. Let me know what you guys and gals think about this chapter. Again, this is from chapter 8, which is titled Lawmen versus Mafiosi, from the wonderful book Super Mafia, Organized Crime Threatens America by Jonathan Harris. All right, everyone. Talk to you later. Take care. Bye.